Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this presentation on key concepts of European history. We are talking about period 3 today. Okay, that's period 3. That's the years 1815 to 1914. This is going to be part 1 of 2 presentations about this time period. So hold on to your hats, and here we go. All right. We're going to start out with a discussion of the Industrial Revolution. Then we're going to move to changes in everyday life that were caused by the Industrial Revolution. And then after that, we're going to discuss the problems of industrialization. We're going to begin our discussion of the maintenance of international stability in an age of nationalism and revolutions, talk about some ideologies. We're going to conclude that discussion in part 2 and also discuss that last bullet. So let's talk about concept 3.1. The Industrial Revolution spread from Great Britain to the continent, where the state played a greater role in promoting industry. So it's important to remember 2 things. 1, the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain and Europe, okay? Number 2, that state sponsorship was something that happened later. In Great Britain, this was largely driven by private industry and private initiative. I'll talk about that in just a second. So, Great Britain established its industrial dominance through the mechanization of textile production, iron and steel production, and new transportation systems. Britain had a lot of natural resources. This is going to be key, okay? Their ready supplies of coal, iron ore, and other essential raw materials allowed Great Britain to grow as an industrial powerhouse, okay? And this promoted industrial growth. Also, you have to understand that the economic institutions and the human capital that existed in Great Britain, human capital being the combination of skills and knowledge and education of workers within the country. Okay, that's human capital. So economic institutions and human capital such as engineers, inventors, and capitalists helped Britain lead the process of industrialization. Again, like I said, this was largely through private initiative. It's not that the government had no role, but it had a supporting role. The driving force was private industry, okay? Britain's parliamentary government promoted this and facilitated this and supported this growth of industrial interest, because those interests were represented in Parliament. And so they did do that, but they did not drive industrialization. That was driven by private individuals. Now, when you look at the rest of Europe, or parts of the rest of Europe, some people followed the British example and others took a slightly different route. So industrialization did take root in continental Europe, but in some cases, this was directly linked to state sponsorship of said industrialization. So let's talk about France. France moved toward industrialization at a much slower pace, much more gradual pace than Great Britain. So there was government support, but there was also less dislocation of traditional methods of production. So traditional methods of production continued to be a factor and continue to dominate for a longer period of time than they did in Great Britain. Now, Prussia, industrialization allowed Prussia to control a wide area of Europe. Okay, so industrialization in Prussia allowed that state to become the leader of a unified Germany. Germany is now unified. Remember, this happened in the latter part of the 1800s or the 19th century. And after this unification took place and industrialization in Prussia began, there was rapid industrialization in Germany under Prussian government sponsorship. All right. Now, throughout Eastern and Southern Europe, the picture and the story are quite different. So a combination of factors, including geography, lack of resources, the dominance of traditional and landed elites, you should think Russia. Okay, the persistence of serfdom, again, Russia in some areas, and inadequate government sponsorship accounted for Eastern and Southern Europe's lag in industrial development. They would eventually industrialize, but that's going to happen much, much later in this discussion. So during the Second Industrial Revolution, okay, more areas of Europe experienced industrial activity, and industrial processes increased in scale and in complexity. Right, so mechanization and the factory system became the predominant modes of production by 1914. You have to remember this, mechanization and the factory system. If you do not know what those 2 things are, then you should go back and review that, because that's kind of important. Just a little bit. All right, new technologies, means of communication, and transportation, which included railroads. The railroads were big. One could argue they were one of the most, if not the most, one of the most dominant economic factors of the 19th century. Railroads were key. Those 3 things resulted in more fully integrated national economies, okay, a higher level of urbanization, so people moving into the city, so you have a concentration of labor force, and a truly global network. This is important. Volatile business cycles, because we didn't really understand it yet. We hadn't come up with macroeconomics as a discipline, so we were still trying to figure stuff out. Volatile business cycles in the last quarter of the 19th century, so 1875 to 1900 or so, led corporations and governments to try to manage the market through monopolies, banking practices, and tariffs. Now, you will learn a lot more about this in economics, but I just want to let you know tariffs, they're bad for macroeconomies. They're bad, but you'll learn about that when you're in econ. All right, so moving on to key concept 3.2. The experiences of everyday life were shaped by industrialization, depending on the level of industrial development at a particular location. But the fact of the matter was, industrialization didn't just revolutionize the economic area of things. It also revolutionized the political sector. Sorry, that's where I was looking for, sector. The political sector, and certainly the sociocultural sector. So industrialization promoted the development of new classes in the industrial regions of Europe. All right, so now we're to, oh, hello, my kitty. Oh, my cat came to visit me. Okay. So in industrialized areas of Europe, in Western and Northern Europe specifically, socioeconomic changes created divisions of labor. This directly led to the development of self-conscious classes, i.e. the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Again, if you do not know what these two terms are, you need to get on that, because those are very, very, very key. In some of the less industrialized areas of Europe, the dominance of agricultural elites persisted into the 20th century. All right, we want to think about Russia here. Russia's a prime example of that, okay? And class identity developed and was reinforced through participation in philanthropic, political, and social associations among the middle classes, and in mutual aid societies and trade unions among the working class. So you have these other associations that are different from just a social class structure, but are more political and economic associations that are also driving this class identity that was such an important factor in the latter part of the 19th century and in the 20th century. So Europe experienced rapid population growth and urbanization, and this led to massive social dislocation. All right, so better harvests were caused in part by the commercialization of agriculture. All right, we developed our technology to be more efficient. We're able to produce more food. So industrialization promoted population growth, longer life expectancy, and it also lowered infant mortality. Coupled with this, migration from rural to urban areas and industrialized regions, cities experienced overcrowding. This is going to cause several social problems, while affected rural areas suffered declines in available labor and weakened communities. So the cities are getting stronger in some ways and weaker in others, and rural areas, same thing. All right, so over time, the Industrial Revolution altered the family structure and relations for bourgeoisie and working class families. Now is where you start to see the development of what we would think of as the nuclear family, the standard relationship between husband and wife, what marriage meant to people. This is where that new concept of what marriage is, what the family is, starts to develop, okay? So the bourgeoisie families became focused on the nuclear family. Mom, dad, kids, right? And the cult of domesticity, this is really, really important. The cult of domesticity specifically assigned distinct roles for women. This is what women were supposed to do, and they were in charge of domestic life. All right, that was their role. So with this cult of domesticity, you get very distinct gender roles for both men and women. By the end of the century, by the end of the 19th century, wages and the quality of life for the working class improved because by this point, many European societies had instituted laws restricting the labor of children and women, social welfare programs that improved the diet, and there was also the use of birth control. Now, continuing on this concept, we have economic motivations for marriage, which while marriage is still important for all classes, it diminished as the middle class. It diminished this idea of marriage as the middle class notion of companionate marriage began to be adopted by the working classes. So the idea is that you marry for a companion. You don't just marry for political or economic stability or to unite political families or economics. You marry because you feel you have a connection with this person and you want to join your life with someone else. They are going to be your companion throughout life. Leisure time also developed now, and it centered increasingly on the family or small groups of friends that was concurrent with the development of activities and spaces that they used for that leisure time, okay? Now, a heightened consumerism developed as a result of the Second Industrial Revolution. When you have leisure time and you have some extra money, you want to spend it on things. So what are you going to spend it on? You're going to consume. So this a concept of consumerism began to develop directly because of the second industrial revolution. So industrialization and mass marketing increased both the production and demand for a new range of consumer goods, including clothing, processed foods, and labor saving and leisure. Also, new efficient methods of transportation and other innovations created new industries. This improved the distribution of goods, increased consumerism, and also enhanced the quality of life. Necessity is the mother of invention. Now, let's move on to key concept 3.3. The problems of industrialization provoked a range of ideological, governmental, and collective responses. Here's where we get into a little bit about ideology. We're going to wrap that up in concept 3.4. So, ideologies developed and took root throughout society as a response to industrial and political revolutions. Remember, nothing happens in a vacuum. Every ideology that you see show up in history is the direct result of what happened before. It is a response to what has already happened, okay? So liberals, and not the modern term of liberal. We're still talking about the old school term of liberal, okay? Liberals emphasized popular sovereignty, individual rights, and enlightened self-interest, but they debated to the extent to which all groups in society should actively participate in governments. Just because somebody was liberal and believed in popular participation doesn't mean they believed everyone in society should participate. Some liberals did not believe the working classes were educated enough or mature enough to actually participate in a sufficient way. Radicals in Britain and Republicans on the continent demanded universal male suffrage. Again, we're still not quite at the point where universal female suffrage is a thing. And full citizenship without regard to wealth and property ownership. Some argued that such rights should be extended to women, so some did, but this was not a driving factor. There were a few people who did that early on. Conservatives are still conservative. They developed a new ideology in support of traditional political and religious authorities. Okay, and this was based on the idea that human nature was not perfectible and needed to be controlled. All right, let's continue in this vein. We have some additional ideologies to discuss. So, socialists call for fair distribution of society's resources, although how you define fair is subject to debate. Of society's resources and wealth, and evolved from a utopian to a Marxist scientific critique of capitalism. Anarchists asserted that all forms of governmental authority were unnecessary. Just bye-bye. Ooh, bye-bye. Get rid of it. Okay? And they should be overthrown and replaced with society based on voluntary cooperation. Following that, we have nationalists who encourage loyalty to the nation in a variety of ways, including romantic idealism, you should know about romanticism, liberal reform, political unification, i.e. Italy and Germany, radicalism with a concomitant anti-Semitism, again, people still don't like the Jews, and chauvinism, this is a male superiority, anti-female attitude, justifying national aggrandizement. If you don't know what aggrandizement means, you go get yourself a dictionary and look it up. It's a good word. Good SAT word, by the way. And, of course, we have the development of Jewish nationalism known as Zionism. This developed in the 19th century as a response to growing anti-Semitism in both Western and Eastern Europe. So governments responded to the problems created or exacerbated by industrialization by expanding their functions and creating modern bureaucratic states, okay? So liberalism shifted a bit. So remember we talked about what that was before. It shifted from simply a laissez-faire attitude to interventionist economic and social policies on behalf of the less privileged. Now we start to see the modern conception of liberalism begin to take shape. The policies were based on a rational approach to reform that addressed the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the individual. Government reforms transformed unhealthy and overcrowded cities by modernizing infrastructure, regulating public health, reforming prisons, and establishing modern police forces. Also, they promoted compulsory public education to advance the goals of public order, nationalism, and economic growth. So political movements and social organizations responded to the problems of industrialization in many ways. We have mass-based political parties, some socialist, others conservative, and everything in between, emerged as sophisticated vehicles for social, economic, and political reform. Workers established labor unions and social movements promoting social and economic reforms that also developed into political parties. Feminists pressed for legal, economic, and political rights for women, as well as improved working conditions. And various private, non-governmental reform movements sought to lift up the deserving poor and end serfdom and slavery. That's the end of part 1. I will see you in part 2. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I'll see you next time.